So in our last chapter, we covered sensory input and motor output, right? Looking at the somatosensory side of the nervous system. And here we're going to switch gears and talk about the more automatic things that happen in the nervous system with the aptly named autonomic nervous system. So throughout this chapter, we're hoping to accomplish the following. We're going to look at the components of the autonomic nervous system. We'll talk about the structures of the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. We'll look at the components of the visceral reflex. And then we'll talk about how the central nervous system coordinates and contributes to autonomic function. For this video, we're going to focus on the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions, and in the next video, we'll cover the rest. So let's get into those divisions of the autonomic nervous system. We're going to compare and contrast somatic and autonomic a little bit, and something to kind of think about for yourself. That way the videos are not too long. We're also going to get into the functional differences between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic divisions. We'll talk about some of the anatomical differences between the two, and then we're going to define and describe preganglionic neurons, ganglia, nerves, and the pathways of these two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So let's talk about how things are organized first. So this is kind of like our general organizing that we see for both sides of the autonomic nervous system. But in general, what we're doing with the autonomic nervous system is we are controlling effectors that we don't need to think about. So like the muscle we find in our heart, the smooth muscle that makes like in our digestive system, glandular tissue, right? Things that you don't want to have to consciously be aware of. So the autonomic nervous system is just that. It's automated, right? It's automatic. So all the things that go with unconscious visceral sensation, involuntary motor responses, that's going to be the autonomic nervous system. And there's really two lower motor neurons involved, the preganglionic neuron and the ganglionic neuron. So there's only two that are forming this chain, right, compared to the three that we generally saw on the somatic end. So the first one, the preganglionic neuron, this is going to be the one that is found in the central nervous system, residing within the brainstem or the spinal cord. And then the ganglionic neuron is the one that will extend from there to come into contact with whatever the effector is. The preganglionic fibers are these small myelinated axons. So we have myelination with that myelin sheath that are going to exit the central nervous system either through a cranial nerve or a spinal nerve. Right, so we'll see this system in both using the cranial nerves and the spinal nerves, and then we'll synapse with those ganglionic neurons to whatever body part, right, needs to be talked to. The ganglionic neurons have an unmyelinated postganglionic axon, and then that's going to be what comes into contact with our target effectors. So there's two sides to the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division. You may have heard of those terms possibly before. More than likely you've heard at least about the sympathetic division, and if you haven't heard these terms yet, you've probably heard the other phrases that are associated with these divisions, and that is fight or flight and rest and digest, right? Especially fight or flight. A good number of us have probably heard about that before. So sympathetic division is responsible for your fight or flight response, sometimes modified to fight, flight, or freeze. So you might hear that as well, depending on who you talk to. And then the parasympathetic division is responsible for rest and digest. And the reason they have these names is that the sympathetic division is responsible for basically turning off, so to speak, or slowing down activities that take time and putting the resources into immediate survival. So let's say, you're going for a walk in the forest, right, and then you hear something in the trees. It might be a bear, right, something scary, something that could be threatening. If that's the case, right, we need to then, we don't care if we're digesting food right now. We don't want to put energy into that at the moment, because at that moment your body is concerned about immediate survival. And so the sympathetic division is going to then basically cause effects or cause different parts of your body to react in a way that will help you with immediate survival. So making your heart beat faster, pumping glycogen into your muscles, breathing deeper, right? Not worried about anything digestive related. Those are things that will happen with the sympathetic division, right? We're worried about immediate survival, and so your body is going to cause changes that can help with that. Whereas parasympathetic is the opposite. There is no direct threat at that moment. We can take our time, so we're not going to have the heart racing. We're not going to be breathing so quickly. We're not going to worry about our immediate, like any sort of immediate danger. We can sit, we can relax, we can digest our food that we have in our stomach, hence the name rest and digest. We're not going to get into the heavy details of what effects each of these divisions cause, simply because that's not for anatomy. But we at least want to keep that in our head of like what these things mean in general. So let's talk about sympathetic division first and how the neurons in the ganglia are organized. So the preganglionic neurons, these are found in the lateral horns that we find in the thoracic and the upper lumbar spinal cord. So generally like in like T5 down to like L1, L2. These preganglionic neurons they can connect to what's called the sympathetic chain ganglia, or sometimes called the paravertebral ganglia. I'll probably use the term sympathetic chain ganglia for you guys, but these are going to run alongside the vertebral column, or we go to a collateral prevertebral ganglia, and those are just anterior to the vertebral column, and we'll see this in a picture in just a second. So when we look at the sympathetic chain ganglia, we have a couple areas that are actually going to extend upward and down or downward that don't directly connect to the spinal cord, and that's the superior, middle, and inferior cervical ganglia, which are going to extend upward, and the sacral ganglia, which will extend downward. Also among the collateral ganglia, we have the celiac, the superior mesenteric, and the inferior mesenteric ganglia. And again, we'll see these in a picture in just a second. So preganglionic fibers, they leave the spinal cord through the ventral roots, spinal nerves, and the white rami communicans to get to their sympathetic chain ganglia and the collateral ganglia. Since the sympathetic ganglia are close to the vertebral column, the preganglionic fibers are short, right? And so we'll see that in the picture. The preganglionic fibers coming from T5 through L2 are going to go through the splanchnic nerves and then terminate at collateral ganglia. Ganglionic neurons are then going to send their postganglionic fibers to a target effector, and since the sympathetic ganglia are close to the vertebral column, these postganglionic fibers are long. So the preganglionic fibers are short, the postganglionic fibers are long. So here's our picture of the sympathetic innervation. I know looking at it, it looks like a mess, but we're going to break it down. Right, so if we are looking here, so here are the cervical sympathetic ganglia, right? And then coming down, that will be the sacral, right, ones. And this is that sympathetic chain ganglia, because you see all these ganglia are chained together, and you see they're relatively short, those preganglionic neurons. They're not super long. It's the postganglionic neurons, or it's the ganglionic neurons that are very long, right? So we see that they come off of those ganglia and boom, right? They have to extend out all the way to that body part. Let's at least point out a couple that matter. So here we see the greater splanchnic nerve. This is going to communicate with some of the like the liver and the stomach and the pancreas. The one I want to point out here is the adrenal gland. We see there actually is not that ganglionic neuron. It goes from preganglionic all the way down. That's the only one like that, though. If you are taking a deep look at this picture, it's the only one that stays red. So everything in red is a preganglionic neuron. Everything in that, I think that's black, is a postganglionic neuron. And so The adrenal medulla, the adrenal gland, is the only one that gets that straight, like complete, preganglionic only. Everything else is going to connect pre and post at a ganglion. We see the collection of splanchnic nerves coming down, the greater splanchnic nerve at the top there, and then 3 splanchnic nerves coming down below it, or a few splanchnic nerves coming down below it. We see these split, so we have the celiac ganglion, which is going to talk to like the organs that are at the top of the abdominal cavity. Then we have the superior mesenteric ganglion, kind of talking to the intestines and whatnot. And then the inferior mesenteric ganglion is kind of talking to some of the lower organs down at the bottom. Right? So this is what we're seeing on the sympathetic innervation side. The cardiac and pulmonary plexuses, so we have that interwoven kind of network to talk to the lungs and the heart. And then the eye and the salivary glands have their own that go directly to them. So looking at the pathways, we have the spinal nerve pathway, the postganglionic nerve pathway, the splanchnic nerve pathway, and the adrenal medulla pathway. So the spinal nerve pathway, this is when the preganglionic axons are going to connect in the paravertebral ganglion, and they're carrying information at the same level, right? So we go back really quickly, going at the same level. So we're synapsing at the same level, right? We're not going higher or lower. The postganglionic nerve pathway, this is where the preganglionic axons are going to ascend to a superior or descend to an inferior ganglion and then carry on. So looking here, right, we ascend up or we're descending down, right, both at the top and bottom there. That would be the postganglionic nerve pathway. The splanchnic nerve pathway is where the preganglionic axons are going to descend to a prevertebral or collateral ganglion, synapse there, and then go through a splanchnic nerve. So if you see splanchnic nerve, you can like think splanchnic nerve pathway. Makes sense. And then the one that I pointed out when we were looking at the picture was the adrenal gland and the adrenal medulla pathway, that the preganglionic axon went straight to the adrenal gland. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. There is no postganglionic neuron. So we go straight to the adrenal medulla. This is the endocrine gland, or the endocrine organ, that it's kind of like a modified sympathetic ganglion. We actually have cells, the chromaffin cells, that are neurosecretory cells, mainly releasing epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are super important for the fight or flight response. So we're cutting out the middleman with the adrenal medulla, which, if you think about it, since the sympathetic division is responsible for things like immediate survival, right? What can we do to help ourselves in an emergent situation? It makes sense that we cut out the middleman. We go directly to the adrenal medulla, not even have a single synapse in that process. At least not between a post and preganglion. So we go to the top. This is our postganglionic neural pathway. And so again, we're just exiting out. We're creating that synapse and exiting out at the same level. So we're not going up or down along that sympathetic chain of ganglia. Down here, B, this is where we are changing levels. So we have to, in this case, we're going up, and that's where we synapse at a higher level. In this case, it could also be a lower level. And then lastly, we're not going to synapse in this chain ganglion at all. In fact, we're going to go through it, but we're going to bypass it. We have a ganglion elsewhere. Right, that's what we're doing here. So this is kind of the 3 different ways, depending on the organ we're talking to, right? Depending on the target organ or target effector, we have these different ways to get to there, to get to that effector. Now with the parasympathetic division, the preganglionic neurons are located in the nuclei in the brainstem and in the lateral horn of the sacral spinal cord. We can connect to the terminal ganglia, which are near their target organ, or the intramural ganglia that are actually in the target organ. So super long preganglionic neurons, super short postganglionic neurons. This is a lot of text. We're going to get through a good chunk of it, and then we're going to look at the picture. So those nuclei in the brainstem, right, when they're controlling facial muscle, like facial organs, not muscles, but facial organs, they're going to send fibers through the following cranial nerves: the oculomotor nerve, right, which will synapse into the ciliary ganglia; the facial nerve, which will synapse in the pterygopalatine and submandibular ganglia; and then the glossopharyngeal nerve, which will synapse to the aortic ganglia. So nuclei in the brainstem controlling the thoracic and abdominal organs, they're going to send theirs down through the vagus nerve to synapse onto the terminal and intramural ganglia. So we have the facial stuff in that first bullet point, and then all of like the viscera, right? A lot of the viscera are going to be controlled with the vagus nerve. And then the parasympathetic neurons and lateral horns, when we look at the bottom, and so we're in the sacral regions of 2 through 4. This is where we get to the pelvic splanchnic nerves for the terminal, the intramural ganglia found in the abdominal and the pelvic organs. So we got further down. These neurons that are connecting with the preganglionic fibers are then going to send their fibers to the target effector. Since the ganglia are so close to the target effector, though, the preganglionic fibers, again, like I said earlier, the preganglionic fibers are super long, the postganglionic fibers are short. So we kind of see an opposite arrangement in the parasympathetic division compared to the sympathetic, where sympathetic, we saw short, relatively short preganglionic neurons and then long postganglionic neurons. And over in the parasympathetic, preganglionic is long, postganglionic is short. So this one's not as crazy looking compared to the other one with the sympathetic innervation. So parasympathetic, not as crazy. So everything we saw in that first bullet point, that first list, is up here. So, right, seeing these ganglia. Notice that these preganglionic neurons are long, and then postganglionic is short. Right, so we have like the oculomotor right here extending out, and then the ciliary ganglion here, and then short neuron to communicate with the eye. We look at the vagus nerve, we see that, whoa, that's a long list, right? We have all these autonomic plexuses, right, all throughout, but that vagus nerve controls the heart, the lungs, right, the liver, the gallbladder, the stomach, the spleen, the pancreas, the small and large intestines, right? A lot of stuff controlled by the vagus. So you can think of like most of your guts, like your abdominal guts, with the vagus nerve, and then the pelvic nerves will handle everything that's like deeper, lower down. So your gonads, male or female, as well as urinary organs like the bladder and the kidney.